The world is asking, aren't they, what is Russia's Vladimir Putin planning? And we live in simply extraordinary times, don't we? We perhaps ask ourselves the question, why does it matter? The world are asking this question. Is that a question we should be asking? Well, Christadelphians, for as long as we've been called Christadelphians, have looked to Russia because we believe that that the head of the Russian state is the king of the north, and that individual is Gog of the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. And we've got a quote there from Brother Thomas's work, Elpis Israel, written 170 years or so ago, where he writes, "The future movements of Russia are notable signs of the times because they're predicted in the scriptures of truth. The Russian autocracy in its plenitude, on the verge of its dissolution, is the image of Nebuchadnezzar standing upon the mountains of Israel, ready to be smitten by a stone. When Russia makes its grand move for the building up of its image empire, then let the reader know that the end of all things as at present constituted is at hand." And so, brothers and sisters, we are asking ourselves the question, are we living in the days when we're going to see very shortly that image power standing on the mountains of Israel? Is Vladimir Putin Gog? Is he the king of the north? And we can't answer that question categorically, but we are looking, aren't we, at the signs and the movements of Russia, and we're excited by it. However awful the circumstances are for so many of whom are our brothers and sisters in places like Ukraine, we look on and we believe that we're starting to see the events which are going to draw us to the time of the end. And it's the mountains of Israel that are of great significance because the reason Brother Thomas writes the image of Nebuchadnezzar standing on the mountains, because Ezekiel 38, shall we open our Bibles and turn there? Ezekiel 38 and verse 8, we read that after many days Gog would be visited in the latter years, so this is the time of the end. "You shall come into the land that's been brought back from the sword, is gathered out of many people, against the mountains of Israel." And so we're going to see this controversy on the mountains. We're going to see the image of Nebuchadnezzar standing on its feet. Now, Ezekiel 38, Ezekiel 39, and the book of Daniel, we see teach us so much about the end times. Keep a marker in Ezekiel 38 because we're going to flick to and from rather. But I want you to turn to Daniel chapter 2 because this story, this narrative in Daniel chapter 2, which we learn in Sunday school, which our children could be learning about when they're very little in Sunday school classes, is absolutely critical in our understanding of what is going to happen at the time of the end. It's not simply a story that Nebuchadnezzar dreamt and is put for us on the record for us to understand the chronology of the kingdoms of men. It's far, far more important for us than that. This image in Daniel chapter 2, we notice in verse 34 that the image, the head of gold, the chest and arms of silver, the belly and thighs of brass, the legs of iron, the feet part of iron and part of clay, he saw, Nebuchadnezzar in his dream, till that a stone was cut out without hands, that's obviously the Lord Jesus Christ, isn't it, which smote the image on his feet. We underline it, on his feet. Because when Nebuchadnezzar, that end time image that Brother Thomas speaks about, is standing on the mountains of Israel, he's standing. And to stand, you've got to have east and west. You've got to have both legs stood up. We don't see this image hopping on the mountains of Israel. We don't see them standing with just one leg. Both feet are on the mountains of Israel. And that's of great significance because we see that east and west are going to have to be speaking together. There's going to have to be a pulling together of Europe, the beast power, and Russia, the eastern dragon power. That's both legs of the image that will need to stand, for the image to stand upright on its feet when the stone cut out of the mountain without hands crashes into the image. And what happens to that image? Then was the iron, the clay, the brass, the silver, and the gold broken in pieces together. The kingdoms of this world are broken in pieces together and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floors, and the wind carried them away, that no place was found for them. And then the kingdom age is able to begin from Jerusalem. The stone builds and builds and becomes the mountain which ultimately will fill the whole earth. Now, come with me further on in Daniel to chapter 11. And to verse 40, where we read of the time of the end again. And we can see, most of you will have these notes already, so we won't spend any time on this, but we understand that Ezekiel 38 and Daniel chapter 11 are talking about the same thing. The king of the north is Gog of Ezekiel 38. And we see the time frames the same, at the time of the end, in the latter years. In Ezekiel 38, we're told the king comes from the far north. Daniel 11 speaks of the king of the north. In Ezekiel 38, we're told he'll come like a storm. Daniel 11, like a whirlwind. In Ezekiel 38, we're told they'll come to the people of Israel. The king of the north will come to the people of Israel. In Daniel 11, we're told that the king of the north will enter the glorious land. In Ezekiel 38, we're told of some of the nations that will be with the king of the north, including Ethiopia and Libya. In Daniel 11 and verse 43, we see the Ethiopians and the Libyans with him. In Ezekiel 38, we see that they come to take a spoil. In Daniel 11, we see that when they get to Egypt, they have power over the treasures of gold and of silver. And critically, in both chapters, we see that ultimately God will destroy the king of the north, the Gogian power and the Gogian confederacy, the image of Nebuchadnezzar standing on the mountains of Israel. Now, with a marker here in Daniel 11 and a marker in Ezekiel 38, come back to Ezekiel 38. Because in Ezekiel 38, we have the language that we find perhaps challenging in verse 2, where the prophecy is against Gog, who is the king of the north, the individual, of the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, or the prince of Rosh, of Russia. The Magogite territory is important for us to understand. The first century Jewish historian and scholar Josephus show that Jews of that time identified Gog and Magog with the Scythians. Josephus goes on to say that Alexander the Great said that the horse-riding barbarians of the far north were locked behind the Caucasus Mountains. So in that Scythian territory, we see more scholars. Magog founded those that were from him named Magogites, Josephus, who by the Greeks called Scythians. Gesenius, scholar at the time of Brother Thomas, tells us that the Magogites were those that the Greeks called the Scythians. Herodotus, a historian at the time of Ezekiel, identifies the Magogite territory with the Scythian territory. And that's of real importance because the Scythian territory stretched from East Germany all the way across to Russia. This huge band of land, big territory, the Magogite territory, the Scythian territory. When we start to work out what's happening in the world today, it's helpful for us as Bible students to know these things. I'm just going to show a very short video.
settled by Slavs. They shared some language and culture, but were divided into many different tribes. Vikings from Scandinavia, known in the east as Varangians, rode up Russia's long rivers on daring raids and trading expeditions. According to legend, the East Slavs asked a Varangian chief named Rurik to be their prince and unite the tribes. He accepted and made his capital at Novgorod. His dynasty, the Rurikids, would rule Russia for 700 years. His people called themselves the Rus and gave their name to the land. Rurik's successor, Oleg, captured Kiev, making it the capital of a new state, Kievan Rus. A century later, seeking closer ties with the Byzantine Empire to the south, Vladimir the Great adopted their religion and converted to Orthodox Christianity. He is still venerated today as the man who brought Christianity to Ukraine and Russia.
So that video just tells us a little, as the microphones are turned down, of the history of that territory, that we see ties together that the Kievan Rus, that the people of Ukraine, and the Russian people. In fact, Vladimir Putin said last summer, in anticipation, no doubt, of what he was planning this year, to have a better understanding of the present and look into the future, we need to turn to history. He goes on to say, Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians are all descendants of the ancient Rus, which was the largest state in Europe. Slavic and other tribes across the vast territory, and he names some of them there, were bound together by one language, which we now refer to as Old Russian. Economic ties, the rule of the princes of the Rurik dynasty, and after the baptism of Rus, the Orthodox faith. The spiritual choice made by St. Vladimir, who was both Prince of Novgorod and Grand Prince of Kiev, still largely determines our affinity today. So what he's saying there is that the faith adopted by the Prince of Kiev, by St. Vladimir, in being baptized into Orthodox Christianity, has created a group of people which in the Belarusians, in the Ukrainians, in the Russians, they're bound together as one people. And so we start to understand, don't we, some of the motive for his actions. And we're also interested to see that the Byzantine Empire is very much linked to this Kievan Rus state. The Kievan Rus was sometimes a trading partner and other times an enemy of the Byzantine Empire. But in 987, Prince Vladimir I of Kiev ruled over the Kievan Rus. He formed an alliance with the Byzantine Emperor Basil II, converting from paganism to Christianity and marrying Basil II's sister Anna in 988. Historical texts describe the subsequent conversion of Vladimir's formerly pagan subjects by mass baptism in the Dnieper River in Kiev. With its conversion to the Orthodox Christianity of the Byzantines, Kievan Rus now began appropriating and adapting Byzantine art and architecture for itself. Well, why is this important? Well, the Byzantine territory is the eastern leg of the image. And so this group of people are baptized into the Orthodox faith. And not only that, they start to appropriate, to take on the culture of Byzantium. They're taking on the culture of one of the legs of Nebuchadnezzar's image, the eastern leg. In the middle of the 13th century, Kiev and many of its former territories fell to Mongol invaders, bringing an end to the Kievan Rus. But after 2 centuries of Mongol rule in the region, the city of Moscow emerged as a new center of power. Moscow was a latecomer among the older cities of Kievan Rus, emerging in the 12th century and gaining wealth and power in the 14th and 15th centuries. The Grand Duke of Moscow, Ivan III, that is Ivan the Great, achieved independence from the Mongols around 1480 and established Moscow as the center of what now became known as Russia. But as Moscow ascended, the Byzantine Empire was declining. Constantinople, today Istanbul, fell to the Ottomans in 1453, ending the long history of the Eastern Roman Empire that had begun when Emperor Constantine dedicated the capital city of Constantinople in 330, which he also referred to as New Rome. So that capital city had been the capital of the Roman Empire. You think the Roman Empire had its capital in Rome? But of course, Rome fell, didn't it, to the barbarians in the west in the 400s. But the Roman Empire didn't die because the Eastern Rome lived on. And it lived on for hundreds more years, for nearly 1,000 more years, until 1453 when the Ottoman Turk came and Constantinople fell. But what then happened as Constantinople fell and Byzantium, in its culture, and Orthodox Christianity looked for a spiritual home, that home became Moscow. In the years that followed, Moscow increasingly viewed itself as successor to Byzantium and even began referring to itself as the Third Rome. In 1472, Ivan III married the niece of the last Byzantine emperor, symbolically cementing the continuation of Byzantium in Russia. And so, brethren and sisters, what we are seeing at the moment is Moscow, Putin, taking steps to bring the old empire. The Spectator ran an article in February that said Putin is rebuilding the empire. Now, as far as they're concerned, it's the USSR. As far as we're concerned, it's the image empire of Daniel chapter 2. When Russia, Brother Thomas wrote, makes its grand move for the building up of its image empire, let the reader know that the end of all things, as at present constituted, is at hand. Imagine, Brother Thomas, imagine some of your fathers, your grandfathers. I know my grandfather would have loved to live in these days, to see the things that we're seeing, to see rather a grand move taking place. We wonder, brethren and sisters, that we are on the cusp. We're on the edge. Are we on the edge of our seats? Are we living in the days when the trumpet is soon going to sound, when we're going to be caught up together with them in clouds and we're going to be taken away? And so we ask ourselves, well, where are we? Where are we in the text? We search the text and we go back to Daniel chapter 11. Because in Daniel chapter 11, we can identify where we are in the text. Verse 40, at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind. And this isn't always an easy section of text for us to understand. But I believe that what we see here is where we are in history. At the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him. Well, this isn't a lecture, and so we haven't gone into every detail, but we need to understand that the king of the north, the king of the south, is the occupier of the territory to the north of Israel, to the south of Israel. Whoever occupies the territory is the king of the north of Israel. Whoever occupies the territory to the south is the king of the south of Israel, right? Well, the Ottoman Turk, as we briefly reflected on, came into the territory in 1453. Before that, but Constantinople fell in 1453. And so they were the occupier of the whole of Byzantium. They were the occupier of the territory. At the time of the end, so you think the Eastern Rome fell in 1453, the occupier then is the Ottoman Turk for hundreds of years. At the time of the end shall the king of the south, whoever is south of the land in Egypt, push at him. And so we ask ourselves the question, well, who is the hymn, and we shall look at it shortly. But I believe, that on the colon after hymn is where we are. That's where we are in history. Because in 1917, the King of the South pushed the Ottoman Turk out of the Holy Land. So let's just quickly unpick this. We might think to ourselves, well, why are we introducing the Ottoman Turk here? Come on, Pete. The King of the North, King of the South, let's just stick with Rome. It's easier for us. Well, we've got to put another section of Scripture, haven't we, on top of this. We put Ezekiel 38 on top of this. Revelation 16, we see the sixth angel pouring out his vial. And this is the last vial that's poured out that leads us to the events of Armageddon. And when that vial is poured out, it's poured where? Onto the great river Euphrates. And we understand, as Bible students have understood for hundreds of years, that the river Euphrates is the symbol of the Ottoman Empire. And so as the Ottoman Empire dried up, so it was pushed out. So the time of the end shall the King of the South push at him. Well, why do we say 1917? Because it was in 1917 that the Turks were literally pushed out of Jerusalem. And they were pushed out by who? Well, they were pushed out by Britain. Because Britain was the King of the South, and we believe that Britain is part of the King of the South Confederacy from here on in. But Britain was in Egypt, occupying the territory for a very specific period of time. And Britain pushed from the end of the 1800s into the 1900s at the Ottomans. And in 1917, General Allenby rode into Jerusalem following the Balfour Declaration, where you remember that the letter was written to Lord Rothschild that Britain would support the Jews in returning to Israel. And so the Ottoman Turk was pushed from Jerusalem because of the British occupation of Egypt from 1882 to 1922. Just a 40-year period in which they took on the role of the King of the South to push the occupier of the territory, the Turks, out of Israel. Now, why is that so important for us to understand? Because we keep reading, verse 40, the King of the North shall come against him. Well, who is the him? Go back, read carefully again. At the time of the end shall the King of the South, who was that? That was Britain in 1917. The King of the South shall push at him. Who did Britain push at? The occupier of the territory, the Ottoman Turk. The King of the North shall come against him. Who is it? It's the Ottoman Turk. Why is it so important? What was the eastern capital of Rome? It was Constantinople, Turkey. And so for the image to be able to stand on its feet, Gog has got to be in control of the west and the east. And so we expect that the Gogian Confederacy of Ezekiel 38, we see, don't we, European nations. Of course, we don't see Tarshish with the European nations, which is why our understanding of Bible prophecy was so clear for so many years that Britain would have to come out of Europe, because she stood on the other side of Gog and the European nations when they dropped down first into Constantinople and then beyond into the glorious land. And so, brothers and sisters, it's critical that we understand these things for us to appreciate what's happening in the world today. And so we ask ourselves, can we be sure? Can we be sure that Russia really is the king of the north? And we reflect, and we look at what we're seeing in the world right now. We look at where Russian troops are positioned. Surely anyone with quarter of a brain, even a primary school teacher, we can get who the king of the north is. It's obvious. It couldn't be clearer. Look where the flags are flying. The king of the north was asked in Ezekiel chapter 38. Just go there, verse 7. Be thou prepared, prepare thyself, thou and all thy company that assemble to thee. Be a guard to them. The king of the north is prepared. And so, brothers and sisters, the question comes to us, are we? Are we prepared? Do we really, truly believe that the Lord could come? We all want the Lord to come. Yes, we believe the Lord will one day come. Do we believe that we're witnessing the signs of the times? Russia's grand move beginning. That we need to sit up, take note, and be a people that are prepared for the coming of the Lord Jesus Christ. And so we see these Russian flags flying. We understand that Russia is going to need to drop into Constantinople. That has to happen, that the image of Nebuchadnezzar is able to stand on its feet. And when that happens, Brother Thomas wrote, having fulfilled the mission of his sacred Russia to put down rebellion, to plant the Greek cross, the Orthodox cross, on the dome of St. Sophia, and to prostrate Europe at his feet, he'll next address himself to the work of establishing his dominion over the East. Isn't it incredible, the things that we've seen of the Hagia Sophia in just recent years? This church, as it once was, this Orthodox church, that when the Muslims changed, didn't they? And they turned it into a museum. And now Erdogan has said, you know what, we're going to have it as a mosque. And Putin is not happy about that. And one day that will change when Russia drops down into Constantinople. We might look on and think, oh, the thing is that Turkey's a NATO member, and you attack one, you attack them all. These nation states will soon be divided. In a democracy, when you choose to vote who you have in power, and that person says, to be honest, I'm fed up of paying this amount of money to drive here, to drive there. I can't turn the heating on in my house. And not only that, I'm hungry. Nation states won't be able to stick together. We'll see, in due course, the Russian power taking control of the region. He's got the breadbasket of Europe. He's got the energy. We'll see shortly. What we read at the moment is all through the eyes of the British press. In other parts of the world, they don't see it in the same way that we see it anyway. And so, as Brother Thomas wrote, he'll next address himself to the work of establishing his dominion over the East. We look at Daniel chapter 11, and we see what happens. He'll come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots, with horsemen, with many ships. He'll enter into the countries. So what do we mean by the countries? Well, you think south of Turkey, you come down into Syria. Well, where's the king of the north? I mean, the Wall Street Journal ran a headline just a couple of years ago, Putin, the new king of Syria. He's the king of the north. The whole world can see it. He'll come down through Syria, through Lebanon. What else is going to happen? He'll enter into the glorious land. He'll come down into Israel. And many countries shall be overthrown. But there shall escape out of his hand even Edom and Moab and the chief of the children of Ammon. That's the territory of Jordan, and we'll see why shortly. He'll stretch forth his hand also upon the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. He's going to come all the way down into the land of Egypt. So he's going to sweep through Israel, down into Egypt. the Jordan to the east of the Dead Sea, they'll be left alone. With him will be the Libyans and the Ethiopians, as we see from Ezekiel 38. More of a confederacy will perhaps join him or be with him at this stage. We don't know. What we are interested to see are articles like this, yesterday. So this is the Reuters news agency. Yesterday, Israel renews gas exploration, expects an export deal to Europe. Israel is renewing offshore natural gas exploration and hopes to reach an agreement soon for exporting gas to Europe, Israel's energy minister said on Monday. Europe is now looking for a quick replacement of supply from Russia. We know Ezekiel 38 makes clear he's coming to take a spoil, to take a prey. We think there's lots of evidence as to why that could be energy, which we won't go into today. But needless to say, if Russia were to come down, we can see at the moment it's an entirely reasonable excuse for them, as far as they're concerned, to drop down into this territory. We also saw yesterday Israel to sign a deal with Egypt, EU for gas exports. So we see, again, motive to come through Israel, where? Down into Egypt. Israel seeks to export gas to Egypt to be shipped to Europe. And so, brothers and sisters, we can see that a possible spoil is in place. We're not dogmatic. We can see a possible spoil is in place to bring the King of the North dropping through these nations, down through Israel and into Egypt. Ezekiel 38, though, as we have said, makes very clear that the controversy will ultimately be on the mountains of Israel. And the mountains of Israel we understand to be the West Bank. If you are in Jordan and you look across the Jordan, the mountains rise up. The West Bank is there. It's west of the River Jordan. And those mountains are spoken of very clearly in prophecy. Turn back to chapter 36 of Ezekiel. Ye mountains of Israel, verse 1, hear the word of the Lord. The West Bank. This is for you, the West Bank territory. You, verse 8, you, O mountains of Israel, the West Bank, you'll shoot forth your branches and yield your fruit to my people of Israel, for they are at hand to come. I'm for you, I will turn unto you, and you will be tilled and sown. I will multiply men on you. All the house of Israel, even all of it, the cities will be inhabited, the wastes will be builded. I'll multiply on you man and beast, and they will increase and bring fruit, and I will settle you on the mountains of Israel. And we've seen, haven't we, this multiplication of men. In 1948, when Israel were brought back into the land, they didn't own the mountains of Israel. That wasn't part of their territory. The United Nations drawing up of the map in 1947 didn't give them the West Bank. But after the events of 1967, they took the mountains. They owned the West Bank. And from that point onwards, Ezekiel 36 was able to be fulfilled. And the multiplying of men was able to build and to build and to build, which is of huge significance, brothers and sisters, prophetically. The United Nations this month condemns the latest Israeli settlement expansion plan. After many days, this is what we're seeing. The mountains of Israel, which have always been waste, they're being built upon. The United Nations condemns it. Why is it that the United Nations condemns these plans? Well, Israel's settlement expansion tramples on human rights law, the United Nations tell us. Most seriously, the purpose of settler implantation, rupturing the relationship between a native people and its territory, is the denial of the right to self-determination, which is at the very core of modern human rights law, they said. The UN has repeatedly stated Israeli settlements in occupied Palestinian territory are a flagrant violation under international law, the rights expert recalled. And yet, despite being in flagrant violation of international law, they keep building. And where do we see the greatest expansion of the building? On the West Bank. It's Ezekiel 36 being fulfilled before our eyes. Many of you were born far before this prophecy even began. Some of us were born far after this prophecy even started. You know. Why is it so important? Apart from Ezekiel 36, what is the United Nations saying about this building? They're saying it's a flagrant violation of international law. Not just any international law, international human rights law. Why does that matter so much? Because in Revelation 16, after we've seen the drying up of the river Euphrates, the final sign that brings the kings of the nations together to the battle of Armageddon, what will draw these nations to come against Israel to the battle of Armageddon? It's the frog-like spirits that draw them. And those frog-like spirits, Brother Thomas identified as the symbol of the French democracy. We haven't got time, we've got 10 minutes. We're not going to go into the history of this. It's a talk for another day. But we understand that his interpretation is bang on. The frog-like spirits are the symbol of the French democracy. Now, what's that got to do with human rights? Well, the French democracy, the French Revolution of 1789 led to what we now see enshrined in human rights law. The idea of the slogan, liberty, equality, fraternity, has given an influence as natural law to the first article of the UDHR, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. So that human law hasn't been born out of nothing. It was born out of the French democracy. It was born out of the events of the French Revolution of 1789. The frog-like spirits began. But we've seen those spirits accelerate, haven't we, in our day? The spirits of human rights, of humanism, in every aspect of society. Think where we have the frogs in Scripture. And everyone's mind, the children's mind, go back to Exodus chapter 8. And the frogs in Egypt, where did they go? They went everywhere. It didn't matter who you were. The frog spirits affected your life. And that spirit has gone out. And that spirit, enshrined now in human rights law, is what the United Nations put weekly on their website as they condemn Israel for building on the West Bank. So, brethren and sisters, young people, we're living in the days when not only is the Nebuchadnezzar image power beginning to make a move, to stand on its feet, we're seeing, even this week, France and Germany desperate to make contact with Putin, to see if they can organize some sort of compromise. Many of the other Western nations are cross that they're doing that. But we expect to see Gomer, the Magog territories, tied together with the dragon power of the East when the king of the North drops down. And they'll drop down to come ultimately to the battle of Armageddon. Just come back to Daniel chapter 11, where we see that Edom and Moab and Ammon, modern Jordan, well, they'll escape. So when the king of the north comes down, he won't go to the east of the Dead Sea. We wonder practically why that might be the case. Well, amongst other things, we're told in Isaiah 16, we haven't got time to turn there, but we know that Moab will become a refuge for the people of Israel. And so as refugees scatter, as this huge confederacy drops down through Israel, the Jews run for their lives. Many will go to Jordan, and they'll go there, and despite everything that Moab represents, and Moab will also have to be brought low when the Lord Jesus Christ and the saints come up round the east of the Dead Sea. But for a time, they will be a refuge to many of the Jewish people. In Isaiah 17, we see the picture of Gog rushing through the nations from Damascus in Syria all the way down through the territories. And eventually, he comes down into Egypt. And tragically, many of the Jews, in running from the northern invader, well, they won't have run down through the south and turned left to Moab, to Jordan. They'll run down to Egypt. And they'll have forgotten the age-old principle, Isaiah chapter 30. Don't trust in Egypt. Why? Well, Egypt will fall. The king of the north is going to come all the way down into Egypt. Chapters like Isaiah 19 are important. Will you just quickly turn there? Come to Isaiah 19. We'll just go in at verse 3. The spirit of Egypt shall fail in the midst thereof, and I will destroy the counts thereof, and they shall seek to idols, to the charmers, to them that have familiar spirits, and to the wizards. And the Egyptians will I give over into the hand of a cruel lord, and a fierce king shall rule over them. Who is this? This is Gog. A reference to have in our margin there is Daniel 8, verse 25. That's the fierce king. That's the fierce king. You remember in Daniel chapter 8, that is the deceiver that deceives the nations. That's what we're seeing today in Russia. I could put so many headlines on the screen that talk to us about how the Russian Maskarovka and how they deceive the nations. How Putin has no qualms whatsoever with not speaking the truth to nations, certainly in a situation of war. We also just want to notice that not only do we come down into Egypt, but Russia becomes confederate, or is already confederate, with the territories to the south of Egypt and to the west of Egypt, to Libya, North Africa in the west, and to the Horn of Africa, to Sudan, South Sudan, Eritrea and the like, to the south. And headlines like this have been really interesting, haven't they, just this last year. Russia's re-engagement with Africa pays off. Because when the United Nations brought a resolution condemning what Russia was doing in Ukraine, many of the African nations said, we're not going to vote. We're not going to condemn them. Much to the ire of the West, who've put all this time and energy and money into African nations. They expected the African nations to stand with them, but recently it's Putin who's engaged with the African nations, and so they stood with him. And it's just interesting to see that the likes of Eritrea, Ethiopia, Sudan, South Sudan were amongst those nations. Russia's growing clout in the Red Sea and the Horn of Africa, engaged opportunism, Russia's role in the Horn of Africa. This is so important because the Horn of Africa, we're talking about Ethiopia, Kush. That's the territory that the world is looking that Russia's engaged in. That's what we would expect to see from Bible prophecy. How to read Russian expansionism in Africa. This is from Politics Today. And look what the article says. Just go to the end there. Thus, Russia is turning to countries in Africa with which it had close ties to during the Soviet period, especially in North Africa and the Horn of Africa. That is Daniel 11 and Ezekiel 38. The world is telling us that they are the countries that Russia is currently interested in Africa. And so, brothers and sisters, we understand that the king of the north will sit in Egypt. He'll take control of the treasuries of Egypt. But Daniel 11 tells us, verse 44, tidings out of the east and out of the north shall trouble him. What is it that he hears? Well, we believe that to the east of Egypt, something's taking place in Sinai. We believe we're going to be there. The rainbowed angel is being prepared to go out to battle, to destroy Gog and everything that Gog stands for. So there we are in the east. To the north, well, Brother Thomas suggests that up in the north, perhaps the Tarshish power is trying to get back some sort of control and support to Jerusalem. But Gog won't have that. And Gog moves with great fury to destroy and utterly to make away many. That means to destroy. And so he goes and he sets up his siege, doesn't he? That we shall look at in our later studies. And he sets up and he puts his flag, as it were, between the seas, between the Dead Sea and the Mediterranean Sea. And we know that he's going to come to his end. Finally, can we wait? Should we get our own houses in order, our own ecclesias and families organized for this? Should we wait until we see Russia drop into Constantinople? Brother Thomas believed that the sixth vial, the drying up of the Euphrates power, the drying up of the Ottoman power, to remove that power to a convenient distance, to diminish, not to increase it, in the region of Sinai. He believed that the drying up of the river Euphrates was to dry up, to remove the Ottoman from Sinai, not as a vacuum for the king of the north to drop into, but that the way of the kings of the east might be prepared. And so his present conviction, writing at the end of the 1800s, was that the gathering together of the national armies against Jerusalem is after the appearance of Christ in the south, that is in Teman, before he appears on Mount Zion. Hence, he says, we have not to wait the advance of the Russian Gog against Constantinople and his overflowing and passing over and stretching forth his power over Egypt and the Holy Land. This will certainly come to pass, but it will be consequent upon, not antecedent to. It will be after, not before, the appearing of Christ in Teman. And so, are we telling ourselves, our families, are we speaking to the goats? Are we making sure that they know there's no time to wait? We can't wait for Russia to come into the land. We've got to today ensure that we are prepared and ready for the call of the Lord Jesus Christ.